Can we keep 1.5 alive? World leaders, decision makers and climate scientists in Egypt are currently locked into the latest round of tense negotiations to address climate change at COP27. There is an urgent ambition to keep global temperature rise at or below 1.5 degrees to avoid the most dangerous impacts of climate change. But what does that mean? Well, it was an aim agreed at the Paris Climate Conference in 2015 to limit global temperature rise to 1.5 Celsius when compared with the time before the Industrial Revolution. That was when humanity started to burn a lot of coal and other fossil fuels, emitting carbon, which, as we know, warms the atmosphere. The rise since those times is already above 1 Celsius and rising, so we only have a short window to put in place reductions of carbon emissions if we are to meet that main goal. The impacts of climate change are already being felt, and above 1.5 Celsius the impacts become more difficult to deal with, more people being dangerously affected and damaging effects to infrastructure and nature. And there is also a greater risk of irreversible changes. So, where are we now and how realistic is the ambition? Well, along the bottom of this graph we have emissions, the amounts of carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases we expect to put into the atmosphere in the year 2030. And this grey bar shows the cuts in carbon emissions by 2030 that were agreed by the nations at last year's COP26 climate conference in Glasgow. One estimate of these pledges, they're known as nationally determined contributions or NDCs, would take 2030 emissions into the range 45 to 49 gigatons. A gigaton is a billion tons or 1,000 million tons. If these obligations were met by 2030, well, what is the likely impact on global temperatures? Let's see. By running climate models many times, we can produce projections of how the global temperature will change over the rest of this century. Each of these hundreds of dots represents the peak temperature of a plausible projection to achieve a global temperature change of 1.5 or below by the year 2100. The y-axis here is showing the highest temperature we would see during the century in each of these projections. It's worth noting here there are a lot of other projections where we don't get back to 1.5 Celsius by the end of the century, but we're focusing here on the outcomes that can hit that aim. Now, some, such as these, show that global temperatures could climb above 1.8 degrees Celsius or overshoot before coming back down to 1.5 Celsius by the end of the century. But others, such as these over here, show that global temperatures may not go above 1.5 Celsius, allowing us to stave off the worst impacts of climate change. Let's take a look at the current pledges, because in this grey line here there are no dots or projections which keep us below 1.5 Celsius throughout the century without, at some point, the so-called overshoot. However, now look at what happens if we slide or increase the level of ambition to the left and reduce climate emissions. We start to see projections under the 1.5 Celsius, showing that the worst impacts of climate change can be averted with increased ambition. And this is what the negotiations are all about. The further humanity can move this pledge bar to the left, the more that can be done to protect, well, humanity. We'll need to see at the end of negotiations this week just how far world leaders have been able to shift the bar on this one. There is a slight catch here, however. There are many more dots still above that 1.5 Celsius line, indicating there are more projections with overshoot, even with all this ambition. So there are two difficult issues to resolve. Large emission reductions are needed to continue beyond 2030, and we also need to physically remove carbon from the atmosphere after 2030. So Can society develop the technology to suck out the excess carbon dioxide from the atmosphere by 2100 to bring global temperatures back down again? Technology to capture carbon and store it is yet to be proven at the scale needed to lower global temperatures. This means that the chances of returning to 1.5 Celsius seem more remote. So, in summary, it is possible to keep temperatures to 1.5 degrees Celsius, and more ambition will not only keep the worst extremes of climate change at bay, but will also mean there is less reliance on developing new technologies.